I think the reason is that they are legally a country and they have a right to conduct their investigations without interference.
In Angels and Demons, the Vatican's struggle to maintain privacy, independence, and influence pushes the Roman Catholic Church into the crosshairs of a terrorist attack.
We must defend ourselves.
And with the world watching, vital questions are raised. Just who are the Church's real friends? Who are its enemies? And just when did the struggle between science and faith begin?
The Church is at war. We are under attack from an old enemy. They have struck us from within, and threatening us all with destruction at the hands of their new god, science.
In both the novel and the film versions of Angels and Demons, members of a secret cult of scientists and intellectuals are thought to be waging a deadly conspiracy against the Roman Catholic Church. The attack is motivated by revenge, presumably for the Church's history of intolerance, largely directed towards those who dare question religious faith.
Angels and Demons takes place entirely in the present, and we certainly reference the past, and there are echoes of the past that are influencing this crisis today. It's another one of the interesting aspects of the story. The intensity of the ongoing pressure between science and religion.
In the case of Angels and Demons, it's these two giant subjects crashing into each other, which is science and religion. Which one is right?
But just when did this conflict between religion and science begin? And are the wounds so deep they could lead to the type of diabolical plot described in Dan Brown's story? In the mid-1500s, in response to what many thought was an attack on religion during the various Protestant reformations, the Roman Catholic Church tightened its grip on the faithful in the form of a series of inquisitions or tribunals. It was hoped that these investigative bodies, largely comprised of priests and clerics, would stamp out heresy and thus ensure God's souls would be saved. Although not all of these tribunals were under the jurisdiction of the Vatican, the period of the Inquisition was often tainted by corruption and hypocrisy, and stained by torture and bloodshed.
If you were known to speak out against the church, a number of things could happen to you. If you were lucky, you would be hanged. They weren't too fond of that because it was too swift. So burning was the option. Sometimes slow burning, sometimes they would burn you deliberately very slowly and then pull you off the pyre for half an hour or so and then put you back on. So that's the kind of thing you could expect.
Of course, notions of sedition, heresy, and speaking out against the church could be widely interpreted and arbitrarily defined. To some, it meant any challenge posed to the Word of God as set forth in the Bible. Anything other than a literal interpretation could mean imprisonment or death. And during the 17th century, the biggest threats posed to the church and its teachings would often be found in the world of science.
We can look back for centuries and see the ways in which the church has officially taught that our faith is not exclusive of reason or even empirical science, that we need both of these things. We need ways in which we can measure knowledge, but there certainly are obvious examples of times when the Catholic Church has collided with science, Galileo being a good example.
Galileo Galilei, a pioneering Italian physicist, mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher. He is known as the father of modern science. Born in 1564, he abandoned a career in the priesthood to pursue the study of science. In 1609, after having made significant contributions to the development of the compass and the thermometer, Galileo made refinements to a new invention called the telescope, increasing its magnification capabilities from 3 to nearly 30 times. Inspired by the writings of Nicholas Copernicus, he soon turned his gaze toward the stars and came upon evidence that threatened one of the cherished teachings of the church.
He gets credited with being the first one not only to start to look at the universe and to suggest this notion that the sun didn't move around the earth. He suggested the earth moved around the sun. And this was just anathema. This was complete heresy to the church.
But the idea that the earth revolved around the sun had been around for at least a century, from the time of Copernicus. And Copernicus himself was a Polish cleric who dedicated his book to the Pope. So it wasn't as if the church was somehow dead set against this idea.
The problem the church had with Galileo was essentially that he used a new technology, a rival authority, to explain the universe. Galileo stopped using just religion, and the Catholic Church didn't like this at all.
It, in a sense, challenged the belief that the world is created, by God in an orderly, hierarchical way, and that the earth was at the center and the human was at the center of the earth. And that made sense to the medieval person.
I think that people feel they are familiar with Galileo. We all have sort of like a grade school understanding of what went down there, but we don't understand why it's important. You've got science versus faith. That is a foundation for a theme that will be constantly argued throughout the course of Angels and Demons.
They call it retribution. They think it justified because of the church's attacks on men of science in the distant past, and it's true. Since the days of Galileo, this church has tried to slow the relentless march of progress, sometimes with misguided means.
In the 17th century, if you were found to be thinking outside the restrictions, then the Inquisition could call you in, and one had the opportunity to recant. But if one stubbornly held on to your own views, then there could be a very, very serious punishment by means of imprisonment, or in the worst case scenario, the burning alive within Campo de' Fiori. But Galileo was so convinced that what he said was in consonance with the faith that reasonable people would agree with him. And this is where, in the end, he goes wrong.
In 1623, the church christened a new pope, Urban VIII. In earlier years, he had been both a friend and supporter of Galileo. Encouraged by this change, the scientist began research that would lead to the publication of his most famous work, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems.
And the Inquisition, pushed on by Urban VIII, brings him in. With the Inquisition, one cannot have a discussion and persuade the judges that you are right. Basically, the Inquisition has already found that you are guilty, and so Galileo is, after 4 hearings, given the opportunity to recant, and he does. And so he abjures his views regarding the Copernican system, and he publicly recants something that he had been speaking about for 3 decades.
And so Galileo spent the rest of his life essentially under house arrest, and trying to work between the science, his worldview, and the worldview that was offered to him by the church.
He was under house arrest first at Villa Medici here in Rome, and then in Arcetri, where he's able to continue his intellectual work and his correspondence and his publications. But at the same time, he was a sort of public figure still, and you had people making pilgrimages, as it were, to go and visit him. And so Galileo, following his trial, would not be propounding these views publicly, but behind closed doors, he could share these ideas more freely.
Galileo died while still under house arrest on January 8, 1642, at the age of 77. But when the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinand II, offered to erect a monument over the grave of the great scientist, he was sternly rebuked by Pope Urban VIII. Still considered a heretic, Galileo was allowed only a modest burial under the bell tower at the Basilica of Santa Croce. And the publication of his works would remain banned for nearly a century. Galileo's death made him a martyr for the cause of scientific thought.
Galileo, the strife and struggle he endured, plays an incredible role in our movie, a crucial, pivotal role.